I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
First, I want to thank Representatives Michael Simpson from Idaho, Paul Brown from Georgia, particularly Chris Lee from New York, as well as Dan Maffei from New York, for helping me draft this bipartisan bill to help protect small businesses from overreaching federal regulations during these tough economic times. In addition, I would like to thank John Leibowitz, Chairman of the FTC, for delaying enforcement of the red flags guidelines until Congress passes this common sense fix. American small businesses are struggling. They are often forced to comply with burdensome regulations that significantly increase their expenses. I am committed to helping small businesses because the key to our economic recovery is tied to their ability to thrive. Today, my bill will clarify the intention of past legislation so that it isn't blindly enforced against America's small businesses. The Federal Trade Commission went too far and went beyond the intent of Congress by considering non-financial service-related industries to be creditors under the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act of 2003. Its ruling would force thousands of small businesses to comply with burdensome, expensive regulations by forcing them to develop and implement an identity theft program. My common sense bill would exempt healthcare practices and law and accounting firms from the FTC's red flag guidelines. In addition, it would create a system where the FTC has some flexibility to waive implementation of the regulations for other industries. During these tough economic times, the federal government should not be placing burdensome regulations on small businesses. Small businesses are the backbone of New Jersey's economy, and they shouldn't be included under a random definition interpreted by a federal bureaucracy. Failure to pass this bill today will hurt America and the hardworking, innovative entrepreneurs that manage and operate small businesses across this great country. Again, I applaud the bipartisan way we crafted this legislation and urge the rest of my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank my colleague Chris Lee from New York for yielding me some time. Mr. Speaker, it is a pleasure for me to come before you today to speak in favor of this bipartisan, common sense bill, which will help so many of our small businesses in our country. In my opinion, the manner in which this legislation was crafted, with input from both sides of the aisle, with the FTC and the various sectors that would be adversely affected if we had not acted, is a model for how this House can work to actually solve the problems facing our country. I wish very ardently that we could get together, Republicans and Democrats alike, and find some common sense solutions to the health care financing in this country the same way that my friend Mr. Adler and the rest of the Democratic colleagues and those of us on our side came together on this. And I think that's the way that this House ought to operate. And I congratulate Mr. Adler for what he has done and the other colleagues on both sides for bringing forth this common sense legislation. And I'd personally like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Adler and Dr. Simpson, for their tireless efforts as we work to put this very effective common sense legislation together. I also want to thank the committee staff that helped in this process. This legislation is a very specific exemption, without which would cost so many small businesses thousands of dollars to unnecessarily implement. But it also allows the FTC the ability to exempt other businesses that aren't one of the three industries outlined in the bill, and that just makes sense also. When acted, H.R. 3763 will truly reflect the original intent of FACTA and codify an exemption for healthcare providers, accounting firms, and law firms that were never meant to be wrapped in this overarching red flag legislation. So again, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Adler, Mr. Lee, Dr. Simpson, and to each and every person who helped bring this legislation to fruition. This is the way we ought to operate, and I think it's just a great day for this Congress as we, as Democrats and Republicans, came together on this common sense legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, but before I close, I would like to reiterate the importance of this bill, so I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Many of America's economic problems are not the fault of small businesses, but they have borne the brunt of the economic downturn. My legislation, Mr. Lee's legislation, Mr. Brown's legislation, Mr. Simpson's, Mr. Maffei's, a bipartisan piece of legislation will prevent one more layer of federal regulations that would add another cost on the backs of small businesses across America. Again, I urge all members of Congress to support this bill. I thank Mr. Brown for his comments about the bipartisan nature of this bill. This is Mr. Lee's and my second bill together. Hope it's the second of many to try to serve the process of this House and to serve the people of our great country.